From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. As recently as 2009, Britain was booming. Baby booming.
It's a baby boom that mirrors the late 40s and early 60s. It's helped push the British population above 61 million for the first time.
And that burgeoning population wasn't just the result of birth rates. Over the decades that preceded it, the UK had experienced waves of immigration, like Windrush, which began in the late 1940s.
Genoa, Friday last. The liner Epernia sails in for the Caribbean. How old are you?
18 years.
Where are you going to stay when you come to England?
Going in a hospital.
You're going to nurse?
Yes.
We also saw waves of immigration from other parts of the world, from the Commonwealth, which Britain created, and from the European Union while we were still a part of it.
Polish is now the second language in the UK.
Punjabi is the third and Urdu is the fourth.
Immigrants bring into our economy £1.2 billion more than they take out in benefits.
But now, that period of population growth appears to have become a period of decline. Tom Calver, the data editor at The Times and The Sunday Times, has been taking a closer look.
Britain's population could actually start shrinking. Birth rates are falling, and net migration could fall below zero. And this could have massive implications for our lives, the economy, and also our politics.
How will a shrinking population affect the United Kingdom and our economic prospects? Are there environmental advantages to having fewer people, and how will it affect the political landscape? The story today: shrinking Britain. Tom, do you have children?
Not yet. It's definitely on the cards in the next few years. So my wife and I got married last April.
No, congratulations.
Thank you. We're going to enjoy a few more months of being dinks, dual income, no kids, I think.
Dinks? Is that
before
the
we get down to that.
Before you have the pitter patter of lots of little Calvers.
Yeah.
Data journalists in the making.
We can hope.
Explain why we're talking about this today.
After years of growth, Britain's population might actually start shrinking. And it feels like we've spent most of the past 20 years talking about how Britain is becoming too crowded and immigration is too high. But two quite interesting issues here might flip that altogether. So on one side, we've got immigration numbers, which are expected to start falling and even go net zero. And the other is falling birth rates. And all of this could happen quicker than we think.
I mean, is this an unprecedented change? Have we known shrinking population numbers before?
Yes and no. So the recent parallel is the 1970s, when the UK population was basically flat between 1974 and 79, as the number of people leaving the UK was greater than the number of babies being born. And of course, some of the coverage, I was looking through the Times archives, and it's quite comparable to what we talk about today. So there were all kinds of editorials lamenting a declining nation and all kinds of moral panics about contraception and all sorts. But there is a crucial difference with the 70s. Back then, the UK had a surplus of young people to keep the state going and to keep public services going. Now we have a rapidly aging population. And so we've never actually been in this position where we're both an aging country that is also shrinking.
That does feel like it could spell disaster. Let's just have a look at the current figures. I mean, what are the figures on both immigration and birth rates?
Let's start with birth rates. We are, as a country, having fewer babies than we used to. And demographers like to talk about the total fertility rate, which is basically the total number of children that a woman could be expected to have in her lifetime. You need just over 2, which is called the replacement rate, to sort of keep the next generation going. And if you go below that, then you're sort of in a period of exponential decline. If you go above that, then you're in exponential growth. And this rate approached about 3 children per woman after the Second World War. So it's called a baby boom for a reason, right?
Yeah.
These days, it's about 1.4. So it's half that. And crucially, it's below the replacement rate, which is getting a lot of people quite concerned.
And what about immigration? How is that looking?
This, I think, is the really surprising one, just given that it feels like we've been talking non-stop about it for the past 2 decades.
Certainly for the past year, it feels like it's in the headlines every week.
Yeah, and it's one of, pollsters like to ask people what's the most important issue facing Britain. And for the past 2 years, it's basically been immigration. Immigration and cost of living are usually the top two. And if we look at the actual numbers, so we went from around 350,000 people per year coming to Britain net around the Brexit referendum. Then it fell to 0 during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And then it shot up soon after that to about 940,000 in 2023. Since then, something quite interesting has happened. So immigration numbers have fallen really quite drastically. But another thing has happened. So the ONS has also revised up how many people it thinks are leaving the country. And the result is that in the latest figures, if we take those two things together, net migration is down to about 200,000 people per year. We're at less net migration than we had in 2016. And if we look at the latest trends and what we can see about visa applications, we actually are looking at net negative migration by the end of this year.
So you might actually end up with a situation where you might have more people leaving the country than are coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think this has quite sunk in yet for politicians. But
It's not where the political debate seems to be.
Definitely not. Reform at top of the polls. It's been one topic on everyone's minds in recent years. But I think certainly by the next election, we could well be in a situation where our population is getting smaller. And of course, demographically, this means we're going to have fewer young people because a lot of migrants tend to be younger. And yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting shift in the way we talk about migration.
So I guess the question is, why is this happening?
I think we should spell out that the most recent period has been unprecedented. It was practically 0 in the 1970s. Then it slowly ticked upwards into the 90s. You start to have much more migration from Western and Southern Europe. And then in the 2000s, you get Polish people coming over. Lots of other countries start joining the EU and free movement. Things take off later and then more countries join. You get the Romanians, the Bulgarians joining. And then Brexit happened, and there was this big promise to take back control, I'm sure you remember, of our immigration system and get the best and the brightest coming here. But no one could have predicted quite what happened next. So we obviously had the pandemic, we left the European Union, and then boom, net migration soars above 900,000 a year. And part of that is down to a post-COVID spring back. I suppose, people weren't moving when they otherwise would have done. New immigration rules were quite liberal and interesting for people in some countries who otherwise wouldn't have had a chance to work in the UK. So we are seeing lots more migration from Nigerians, Indians, people from Pakistan and other countries. Some have dubbed this the Boris wave after the Prime Minister who was in charge, of course, at the time. But it's a complete shift, this sort of third wave of British migration that sort of changed Britain.
When we talk about things like the Boris wave, I suppose we ought to say that, Boris Johnson again talked a lot about immigration and the dangers of it, but allowed a huge number of people in. It's kind of been the guilty secret of governments for a long time, hasn't it? That it actually kind of helps your economic figures.
It does. But I think the economy figures since 2019 have been quite stark, right? So Britain's economy has grown about 6% since 2019. So not fantastic. But it's even worse if we look at it on a per capita basis, because that's kind of what matters, right? It's how rich each of us individually are. Per capita, we're up 1% since 2019.
Wow.
This is not really sustainable economic growth if you're simply adding people to the pile without making those people richer.
It's just massaged the figures for a while. It's made it look like your GDP is going up.
Exactly.
So what's changed? How have you gone from a Boris wave and a huge, unprecedented number of people coming into the country to it suddenly being in reverse?
So I think there was a lot of panic, certainly by the Sunak administration and to some extent the Labour government that followed. I think that the important thing to consider through all this is that because these figures are slightly lagged, they're slightly behind. The latest figures we have now are the year to June 2025. Now, of course, since then, there's been a lot of migration and we don't know really what's happened with regard to that. So the government is always 6 to 12 months behind with this. Now, in March 2024, the government tightened the rules on care workers. So they were no longer allowed to bring dependents. Then the salary threshold was raised for skilled workers as well. But by that point, of course, things were already turning and the numbers were fallen. Then Labour basically published this much-awaited white paper with measures that it said would cut immigration by a further 100,000 people. And so from July, skilled workers and healthcare workers now had to be graduates, except for those in shortage positions, and restrictions on dependents were increased again. And the results have been quite striking. So although we don't know the immigration numbers up to date, we do have a sense of the number of people who are applying for visas. And this gives us like an early taste of what the future immigration figures might be. So the number of health and social care visas fell from 18,000 in August 2023 to 600 just before Christmas.
Sorry, 18,000 to 600?
Yeah, 18,000 in August 2023 to 600 just before Christmas.
I thought you were going to say 6,000, and that would still have been stock, but less than 1,000.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. So basically, the latest figures coming through suggest that immigration is falling much quicker than the government expected.
And the other half of the immigration or migration, net migration question is the number of people leaving. What do we know about that?
This one is really hard to measure. So the traditional method that the Office for National Statistics used was they would send a load of people to airports and ports with clipboards, and they would ask you...
How quaint.
I know. Pen and paper, and they'd ask you, are you leaving Britain?
Do you intend to come back?
Yeah, and they're now doing a different measure that looks at payrolls. So looking at official government data and how many people are basically coming off the payroll, leaving the workforce, presumably for other countries. And they're using this to estimate emigration. And what they found is that actually the number of people leaving Britain is much higher than originally thought. A significant chunk we think it is people who came to Britain 20, 15 years ago from Eastern Europe who are now deciding to return home.
So Poland, which now has such a flourishing economy, there's better prospects being there.
Exactly. I mean, Poland has been on an absolute tear economically, and workers might feel that they might have a better chance back home. But what is clear is that overall emigration is much higher than we thought it was. And so immigration has fallen, emigration is up, and this is why the net migration figures are expected to be much lower than we think.
So Tom, you've explained why net migration seems to be falling and how that might have an impact on the workforce, the number of people paying taxes into the system. The other part of the reason that the population seems to be shrinking is the birth rates. Tell us about that. Why do we think birth rates are down?
There are generally two main camps of thought with this. So one is that it's the economy, it's economic factors. It's the fact that that having children obviously costs hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds and that it's simply too expensive. Now, I think that there's a lot to be said for that viewpoint. Childcare obviously is astonishingly expensive. But I think there's another interesting counterpoint that families, if you think back after the Second World War, families managed to have 3 children each. That was the sort of typical fertility rate at the time, and yet had a fraction of the income in real terms that we have today. And so I think just looking at the economy doesn't tell us the full picture. And I think it's quite interesting if we look at countries that have done very generous benefits for new mothers. So Finland, for example, in Britain we cap that, or at least until recently have capped the amount of benefit that we give to parents of children. In Finland, they do the opposite. They actually pay you more with every subsequent child. And yet, Finland has actually seen quite a significant fall in birth rates in recent years. So it does look like, throwing money at sort of pro-natalist policies doesn't always produce the desired outcome. So that's one side of it. But I think probably the most important factor of it all. I think it all boils down to the opportunity cost of having children. Our lives now they're fun, they're fulfilling, but if you have children, then there's a sense that you'll have to give up things, so no more travel, and there's a sense that it will cost you lots and lots of time. And we can talk about this later, but for women, it's the opportunities of a career progression.
Yeah.
But also there is still a motherhood penalty. So the average mother loses about £60,000 in total pay before the child is 5 years old, which is absolutely astonishing.
Still keen?
We'll see.
We should say it's not just the UK where this is happening. It is astonishing to look around the world and realise that very different societies, very different parts of the world all seem to be having the same problem.
basically every country in the world is on a downward fertility trend, with a couple of interesting exceptions. So, as we've said, to maintain the same population size, you need to have 2 children. And most of Western Europe has struggled to reach this level for some time. But even in like India, for example, the world's most populous country, it has recently fallen below 2 children per woman and is falling even further. And the one exception is Uzbekistan in Central Asia, which went from 2.2 children per woman in 2012 to 3.5 children in 2023.
What are they doing?
They actually hand out medals, silver medal for 6 children, gold at 7. No, I'm not for a second suggesting that's the reason. But I think...
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people listening will wonder whether a medal would really be enough. I mean, if you're going to have 7 children, you're going to need a bigger house and a bigger car. I'm not sure a gold medal quite cuts it.
No, and that definitely is not the reason. But I think what's interesting is that a lot of mothers are having children quite early in Uzbekistan, and it's becoming increasingly religious as a country. So I think there's a few cultural factors that have changed that have just sort of swung the dial in favour of having more children. But Uzbekistan really is an outlier. And so this is the challenge that every government is basically facing up to.
The obvious incentives of here are higher benefits if you have more kids, as they are in Finland, might not work. But what about just things like childcare costs? In countries where they cover those, does that make a difference?
The short answer is yes, but not by a lot. So there was this study that basically looked at lots of different countries and policies around the world. And they basically found that a 10% increase in childcare subsidies can raise fertility only by 0.4%. So it's having a difference, but it's really at the margins. And so I think you've got to consider all these different reforms, better childcare, better maternity leave, paternity leave, as a sort of bundle of things that might together not just change the economic situation in favour of having children, but also change the culture around it and making it more, more just sort of socially acceptable, but also socially easy to do so.
Yeah, it does feel like a number of governments are taking this on as a real issue. You know, you mentioned Uzbekistan handing out medals. In America, there's almost talk of it being your patriotic duty now. I mean, Elon Musk in particular seems very keen on populating the world with mini Musks.
Yes, unfortunately, or fortunately, this whole debate has been slightly commandeered, I think, by pro-natalist billionaires. And I think that this is part of the problem. You know, it's often this idea that we should be having more children has, until recently, I think, been dismissed as a sort of quite fringe idea. And data actually shows that progressives in America are having fewer babies than conservatives. So I think there is a real ideological divide in all of this, but ultimately this affects us all. And I think we need to start thinking about how we, as a society, wake up to the reality of declining birth rates.
And what are the problems of declining birth rates? I mean, we touched on the economy earlier. Remind us of that.
We're going to have far more pensioners per worker in the future. And I think, we're going to have to find a way as a country of funding this. Old people are expensive. The average NHS spending per person on someone aged 45 is around £2,000. For those aged 85, it's £13,000. So, all of this is not going to come cheap. Another interesting point is that markets might not lend to ageing countries. It's funny, Donald Trump has been talking about this idea of 50-year mortgages, but the reality is that if people are still going to be borrowing money and paying it back well into their 70s post-retirement, I think a lot of banks might turn around and be unhappy with that. So I think it's really interesting to see how that plays out as well.
What about politics? How does a dwindling population change the political outlook?
Because of the lag in reporting, we probably won't realise until somewhere in 2027 whether or not we have zero net migration. And of course, that'll be about 2 years before a probable general election. So chances are we will see Labour claiming credit for this drop in immigration. In reality, the responsibility is kind of shared with its predecessors, all those reforms that we've seen in recent years, but also the fact that the system is simply rebalanced after kind of spiking up and spiking down. But I think what's really interesting is it could blunt the central message of reform. So Nigel Farage's party, they reached 30% in the polls a few months ago. Farage has been very clear that he wants a one-in, one-out immigration policy. I wonder whether net zero migration was never talked about during the Brexit referendum. A key tenet of it was meant to be this idea that we could hire the best and the brightest from around the world and become Singapore-on-Thames. And I almost wonder whether we might see a slight sort of resurrection of that idea. But I think it's really tricky because we've tried high immigration and that was sort of a disaster politically. I think it's really interesting to see what happens with regard to zero migration and whether anyone's brave enough to actually start saying, oh, maybe we should have more people coming to Britain.
Yeah, how it's talked about in the run-up to the election. What about the environment?
Yeah, this is the classic contrary argument. So on paper, it seems obvious. We might think that fewer people is better for the planet. So a common fear is that we'll run out of food and resources. But there was this fascinating book from the 60s by this American geographer called Paul Ehrlich, and he basically argued that humanity faced this stark choice: population control or a race to oblivion, he said. Unless we drastically cut the number of humans, which then stood at 3.5 billion, the subsequent decades would bring famine, societal collapse, and extinction. And yet the population has doubled, more than doubled since then. We're about 8.2 billion people. And actually, humanity has found a way to get better at producing food. We've actually become more efficient when it comes to things like carbon emissions. Per capita, emissions in Britain and some other Western countries have been falling for quite a few years. And there does seem to be some decoupling between emissions and population growth.
Yeah.
So I think that the classic argument that it might be good for the planet doesn't necessarily hold.
Yeah, well, especially if you end up replacing workers with more AI and data centres, because that's terrible for the environment, it turns out.
Yeah, I think the counterpoint, though, is that recently the doomsday clock, which is this indicator of how close humanity is to the apocalypse, does appear to be closer than ever, according to the experts who put it together. So it's now at 85 seconds to midnight, down from 89 seconds last year. This is down to a number of things like global war, climate change, and artificial intelligence. So I think we as humans love nothing more than talking about how we're all going to become extinct. And I think, yes, those are real challenges. But I'm something of an optimist, I have to say. I think humanity tends to be quite good at finding solutions to these big problems.
Well, Tom, in terms of solutions, we've talked a little bit about how one of the big causes here is, women working. It's kind of the rise of feminism. I'm slightly afraid that in some parts of the world where population has become a real crisis, like South Korea, you're seeing almost a backlash against feminism. I mean, is that one of the potential side effects of this?
Yeah, I mean, South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world, so about 0.7 per woman into 2023. There's a huge pressure there around education and career. It's almost like the pressure and the fear of deviating from that to then have a child might be a strong reason why fertility rates aren't higher there. And it sort of goes back to what we were talking about, the opportunity cost there, and the fact that, yes, I could have a child, but I will lose X many tens of thousands of pounds in lost earnings, and I will also lose this important career progression. But yes, it is unfortunate that this has translated into a backlash against women. And the reality is that we as a society need to have a serious chat about how we allow those two things to happen, how we allow women not to lose out on earnings through having children, but also how we do encourage children to be had.
What about immigration? In the long run, do you think this will change our attitudes to immigration?
Immigration attitudes can change quite quickly, as we've seen over the past few years. I mean, nobody was talking about immigration in sort of 2018, 19, 20, 21, and then all of a sudden it was everywhere. We shouldn't assume that falling birth rates alone are enough to soften attitudes to immigration. So Japan, for example, has seen really low birth rates for some time, and yet right-wing populists are gaining ground in Japan, and there is a recurring anti-immigration current even there. So I think we shouldn't assume that because of falling birth rates and the population crisis that all of a sudden we're going to be, gates wide open to migrants. The world doesn't quite work that simply. But I do think that the politics of immigration at the next election could look very different indeed. And I think we're going to see some parties, it probably won't be those on the right, but I think some of the centre and left parties, if they're feeling brave, might start to make that case again for why actually it is some migration, a small amount, is necessary.
That was Tom Calver, data editor at The Times and The Sunday Times. The producer today was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Tim Walklate, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.